world. Not everyone's going to get this.
Great day to you. This is Gray Transforms. I am Travis Gray. Today we are transforming with our guest, Dr. Stephen Taylor. Stephen is a prolific scholar in the field of transpersonal psychology. Stephen was the chair of the transpersonal psychology section of the British Society. He has published several books on psychology and spirituality, including The Leap, Spiritual Science, and more. Eckhart Tolle tells us that his work is an important contribution to the shift in consciousness. Dr. Taylor's latest publication is Disconnected: The Roots of Human Cruelty and How Human Connection Can Heal the World. I'm excited to have this conversation with Dr. Stephen Taylor because I have ran into his articles so many times over the years. A prolific scholar in the field of transpersonal psychology. Thank you so much, Stephen. How are you?
I'm great, Travis. Thanks for inviting me. It's great to be with you.
Absolutely. How did you end up in this field? How did you become such a prolific scholar? You've always been interested in writing. You've always been interested in spirituality. How did those two things come together? How did you find the field of transpersonal psychology?
The first time I heard the term transpersonal psychology was in a book by Ken Wilber. And this was probably, I was probably in my early 30s at the time. So this is about 20 years ago. And as soon as I saw this term, transpersonal psychology, I thought, this sounds like me, And I thought, then I read more about it, what it meant, what it dealt with. I thought, this is exactly what I'm doing. This is exactly where I'm meant to be. I had this really powerful sense of being at home in this field of transpersonal psychology, because I'd always been interested in spirituality from being a teenager, from reading books about mysticism and Buddhism and meditation, and going along to the talks of spiritual groups. So I was always interested in spirituality, and at the same time, I was always interested in psychology and philosophy. I was always had a kind of like a slightly academic side to my mind, So when I found out about transpersonal psychology, it was a perfect marriage, the marriage of psychology and spirituality. It was exactly what I was meant to be doing. So at that time, I was not an academic, but I went back to university to do a master's degree in transpersonal psychology. Luckily, well, maybe it wasn't just luck, but I found out there was a master's degree only 30 miles away from me. I live in Manchester in England, and this master's degree was in Liverpool, which is very close. So it was perfect, and I stayed on to do a Ph.D. after my master's degree. And then I became a researcher and lecturer in transpersonal psychology.
That's awesome. That it's fascinating that you found transpersonal psychology through Ken Wilber's work. I know that other people have as well, but he has transitioned, or over the years he transitioned into a specific focus in integral psychology, which I often think are very synonymous. That there are very slight nuanced differences in the ways of using those terms. But really fascinating and powerful work of Ken Wilber. How did the Liverpool master's degree in transpersonal psychology, has that been there a long time?
It was started by a guy called Les Lancaster, who was one of the kind of you're probably familiar with him. He now runs the Aleph Trust. And he's for a long time he's been one of the most sort of well-known British transpersonal psychologists.
Absolutely.
So it was him and a guy called Mike Daniels, who was also a well-known British. So the two of them started this course probably in the early 90s, I think.
Awesome.
So for a long time it was the main center of transpersonal psychology in the UK. They're in Liverpool, but unfortunately now the course, well, actually, there's been a kind of a full circle, because the university stopped the transpersonal psychology course about 10 years ago, but now it's come back through the Aleph Trust. The Aleph Trust is associated with Liverpool John Moores University, so there is a link now between the LF Trust and Liverpool.
Awesome. Awesome. So now you've just recently published this new book, Disconnected, and it's about this relationship between the disconnected society, maybe of our past and our current. There's a lot of disconnection in our society, and we find that this is connected to these ideas of patriarchy and hierarchical structure, societal dominance, and things like this. And then we have also, I think we have a growing population of people all over the modern world with this, in this age of information, that are becoming more and more awakened, and the quote unquote awakened, but having this sense of altruistic knowing of the interconnectedness in the world. And so can you tell us a little bit more about what that book Disconnected is about?
It's based on a model of mine, which I call the continuum of connection. And that has a kind of, it can be applied to individuals, and it can also be applied to societies. So individually, we move from extreme disconnection, which is equivalent to psychopathy, or an extreme lack of empathy, a complete lack of empathy, which manifests itself in brutality, cruelty, and so forth. So that's one side of it. And the other extreme is awakening or wakefulness or enlightenment. Enlightenment or wakefulness is a sense of union, a sense of intense connection with other human beings, with the world itself, with nature, with the whole cosmos. So I think of psychopathy. Psychopathy is basically a complete lack of empathy for other beings. It's a complete state of separation, a state of extreme ego isolation. That's actually the polar opposite of the wakeful or enlightened state, which is where there are no boundaries between the self and the world, or between the self and other beings. And between those two extremes, you have, what we call normality, normal human beings. Normal human beings are capable of some degree of empathy, but they can also behave selfishly and egotistically. So I think, spiritual development is about traveling along the continuum of connection, from disconnection towards increased connection, which manifests itself in increased empathy, increased compassion, increased altruism. So there's also a link between criminality. There are lots of causes of criminality, but criminality is linked to a lack of empathy. That's why it manifests itself in brutality and violence. And it manifests itself also on a social level, on a political level. I've got a couple of chapters where I talk about the phenomenon of pathocracy, which is when the people I call hyper disconnected, extremely disconnected people with a complete lack of empathy are drawn towards positions of political power. So they often end up, constituting the governments of nations. So people like Stalin and Hitler are extreme examples, but there are obviously lots of examples in the modern world too, including in my country, the UK, unfortunately. But yeah, so there are different manifestations of human nature and human behavior in terms of this continuum of connection. And on a social level, you have extremely disconnected societies, which are extremely patriarchal, extremely hierarchical, authoritarian, low status for women. They are often very sexually repressive, very monotheistic, intensely monotheistic in a fundamentalist way. And then you have sort of more connected societies, which tend to be more egalitarian, in terms of male and female influence, and also generally less hierarchical, more democratic, less authoritarian, more sexually open, and usually less religious as well. So again, there's this continuum of connection, moving from extremely disconnected to more connected societies. And, many societies are in the middle of that continuum. Like, I'd probably say that the UK, societies like the UK and America are probably somewhere in the middle of that continuum.
Do you think that maybe on a government level, that there's like a difference between the societal experience of being, for example, being in America or being in the UK, that there's an experience that's maybe more interconnected. Maybe you feel more connection to your neighbor, but then recognizing possibly that the governmental structure that is overarching is incredibly disconnected.
Possibly, yeah. I mean, you could think of it in countries like, let's say, China or Russia. In countries like China and Russia, there is a certain degree of equality between genders, a certain degree of sexual openness. But the political structures of those societies are extremely authoritarian, extremely non-democratic. So there is a kind of a disconnect there between ordinary people's experience. But I think that can be explained in terms of pathocracy, that most of the government of China and Russia, like other governments around the world, are made up of, what you could call dark triad personalities with high levels of psychopathic, narcissistic tendencies, Machiavellian tendencies. Especially in non-democratic societies, positions of political power are almost always filled with those people, because they're the most ruthless. They're the most, they feel the strongest desire for power. They're willing to exploit, manipulate, and even kill other people in their quest for power. So unfortunately, you always end up with those people in positions of power. In more democratic societies, there's less likelihood of dark triad personalities filling positions of power, but it's still, it's still quite prevalent.
It seems that when I'm in my travels around the world, that the people outside of the country of the United States of America, they tend to see Americans as inherently narcissistic, inherently independent, and having a sense of problem, a sense of disconnection, feeling that, oh, Americans are so disconnected and so narcissistic, having these sort of dark triad personality qualities. Do you what do you make of that impression that others are getting from Americans?
Well, I mean, America is quite a competitive society. I mean, it's founded on the notion of individualism, I guess. But I'm not sure. I mean, I know lots of Americans who are not particularly narcissistic.
Yeah.
Maybe there are some sort of cultural trends. Maybe there are sort of a certain degree of cultural conditioning. And like Europeans, particularly English people, we're conditioned to be quite reserved and quite kind of self-deprecating. So maybe there are slight differences, but I don't really think that beyond a certain degree of cultural conditioning, I'm not sure if there's much difference really. Maybe if you live in the Midwest, in the sort of away from the coast of America, maybe you're less connected to global trends. Maybe you're slightly more insular. Maybe that's a factor. Whereas if you live on an island like Britain, where there's lots of influences from other countries, and lots of waves of immigration over the centuries, bringing lots of new cultural norms and so forth. Maybe that makes us slightly less insular. I'm not sure.
Yeah, definitely a lot of interesting, intricate nuances and dynamics and ways that people could be influenced to be one way or another. I'm actually from the Midwest. I'm from like the heart of America.
Oh yeah.
Nebraska, Iowa area, and there's a school in Iowa that is about transcendental meditation. I can't remember the name of it. I didn't find out that school existed, and it's sort of in the center of Iowa, which is in sort of the center of America. I didn't find out about that until I moved away. So it's interesting how just like this can be seen. Like Texas. Maybe you don't know this, but Texas, Austin, Texas is sort of in very, very close to center of Texas, but it's a blue community in a red state. And so the red state tends to be very, very rural in like the larger landscape of the state of Texas. and there's judgments that are made between red and blue and things like this. And I really am not a fan of the rigid dichotomy of these things. That is, and it's just, it aligns with my name. This is Gray Transforms. This is about weaving together these things. I'd rather be purple than blue or red, things like this. So and I think that really aligns with this field of transpersonal psychology. But do you think that people in this field, or spiritual people, or people that can be awakened, do you think that there could be a spiritual bypassing that continues to make people, maybe that people will convince themselves of their altruistic qualities and their tendencies towards this connection and knowing the interconnectedness of the world, and at the same time separate themselves from those that are maybe not as open to the information of this interconnectedness and spirituality, religion and stuff?
I'm not sure if that's a particular issue with transpersonal psychology itself.
Yeah.
But I think it's an issue with spirituality in general. You know, I've met a lot of spiritual people who, they are quite narcissistic, and sometimes if you get involved in spirituality, you think that you're, you sort of gain this special knowledge which separates you from other people, which makes you superior to others. So people feel they're a bit, they're a member of a special clique. That can happen. But it's also encouraged by gurus. There are many, I mentioned earlier about pathocracy, how people with dark triad traits are drawn to political power. They're also drawn to be spiritual teachers. There are many corrupt spiritual teachers, too many, way too many. And basically, if you've got a desire for power, if you're a dark triad personality, then, to be a spiritual teacher is the ideal occupation. It's even better than being a dictator, because you can form your own little cult or community, which is isolated from the outside world. You can sort of transcend all normal notions of morality. You can create an atmosphere of unconditional devotion amongst your followers. So there are many spiritual teachers who are or have been, corrupt in that sense. I mean, there are obviously some genuine spiritual teachers too, but unfortunately, there are some exceptions to that. And I think many followers of spiritual teachers encourage that. There are many followers of gurus who want to believe that their gurus are perfect beings, who infallible beings, who are entitled to transcend normal morality, and when they behave in appalling ways, it's some kind of divine test, or some kind of divine play, or it's so that they make excuses for their guru's behaviors because they want to remain in the state of unconditional devotion. I call it the abdication syndrome. It's when you abdicate responsibility for your own life and hand it to your guru, or to your cult leader, or even to your political leader. And you can return to a state of childhood. You can return to that state of early childhood when your parents were perfect, infallible beings who looked after you and took responsibility for you and organized everything for you. So people switch into that kind of infantile state, and it's a very pleasant state to be in, and it's very, it's very appealing. So that I think that's why so many people are willing to follow corrupt teachers.
Yeah, it can definitely be appealing to have no necessity of responsibility in one's life, for the ways that maybe your thought process or your sort of perspective that you've been influenced and impacted by so strongly, it has created the dynamics of your community and your family and the way that you are living your life. It can be a great experience to have all of the maybe the misnomers or the mistakes that are involved in that sort of way of thinking to just abdicate that to your spiritual guru.
Yeah.
I like that. Yeah. So
Yeah, it's a strange paradox, really, because spirituality is about connection, and spiritual awakening is about becoming connected or united to other beings or to the world itself. And some of the people who masquerade as being enlightened are actually, extremely disconnected people. So they're really disconnected people masquerading as connected people. And yeah, so it's not genuine spirituality at all.
yeah. Yeah, and I like that you pointed that the field of transpersonal psychology is very encompassing and integrative, and seeks to understand the perennial philosophy that is within all of these different spiritual traditions. So it tends to sort of like heal itself from the potential of that spiritual narcissism at times. Not to say that
Mm.
it can't also exist. It can just also exist anywhere, but also that like spiritual bypassing is kind of less likely to be there when it's grounded in scientific rigor and just looking to be very articulate and defined and understanding of the different ways that all of this can be weaved together.
Mm.
You had an article that I was originally inspired by your work, that was called pre and trans the pre and trans fallacy. And right now you just spoke about like the childhood, the childlikeness and things. And I think something about your article that was fascinating to me was that and that resonated to me, and you can let me know if I'm getting this right. That it sounds to me like there is value in the spiritual. There's like the spiritual worthy valueness in being a child. You are fresh from creation. You haven't maybe like 0 to 5 or early. You haven't necessarily created the ego experience. This
Hmm.
persona is not fully developed, so you're just kind of fresh and open to the world. You're open to the experience of the world. But then as an adult, when this comes full circle and you've went through maybe an experience of having created the persona, having created the ego, and then that has developed along some sort of trajectory, and maybe there's been mistakes and you've recognized the shadows and done some of these works, and then out on the other side kind of had more transpersonal like experiences. But then the having went through that ego trip, having gone through that ego trip during your life,
Hmm.
having and then come out onto the other side, it seems like there's even more value. There's even more. You in the article you wrote about it being intense, or the level of intensity being different. And I wonder if you could elaborate on this.
Yeah, I mean the article was I was arguing against Wilber's kind of hierarchical view of spiritual development,
Right.
which is he associates spiritual development with trans-egoic development. You have to develop an ego, and then you transcend the ego, and then you can enter the realm of transpersonal development. But I've always felt, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that children, there are many aspects of the childhood state, particularly the early childhood state, which are kind of recaptured in spiritual development. And there are genuinely spiritual aspects of childhood which we lose as we enter adulthood. So I mean, probably the best example is children's incredibly intense perception of the world around them. They have this incredibly fresh, vivid perception. The world is such an incredibly real place to children. It's full of suchness. I think it's partly because children haven't developed a conceptual understanding of the world. They don't see the world through the prism of language. So they see the kind of the naked isness of the world. And that's why children are so invigorated and so exhilarated by, so-called mundane phenomena which adults barely pay attention to. So we recapture that in spiritual development. It's as if a veil of familiarity falls away, and suddenly the world is beautiful and vivid and real again. And also the fact that children are intensely present. They don't live in the past or future. The past or future don't really exist to them. And also the fact that children have this incredible natural vitality, this energy. Michael Washburn, the transpersonal psychologist Michael Washburn, he writes about this very well, I think.
Yeah, I'm sure but all of the authors that you've already mentioned are here. Like Ken Wilber is in this section.
Oh,
Michael Washburn is probably somewhere here. Michael Daniels is here. Les Lancaster's somewhere.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they're all there.
Yeah, but he writes about this really well, how children are in contact with the divine ground. I think because of the divine ground, if I remember rightly. But we lose that. Once the adult ego develops, we become alienated from the divine ground. And so we lose that kind of radiance and vitality which children have. And also in the process, we lose that intense perception, and we start to live in abstraction. We start to become alienated from the present by living in the past and future. So as we move into adulthood, we become alienated from the divine ground. But through spiritual development, we recapture those elements. We recapture that vivid perception, that nowness, that vitality and inner radiance. But that doesn't mean that children are enlightened. Anybody who has got children knows that they are not enlightened. They are, they have characteristics of wakefulness, but they can also be very narcissistic. And so there are certain aspects of adult wakefulness which children lack. For example, that all-embracing sense of empathy, that global perspective on reality, that comes with adult development. So what we get in kind of adult transpersonal spiritual development is a kind of integration of certain higher qualities with those childhood qualities of natural wakefulness. So it's a kind of in a higher level integrated wakefulness. It's a kind of a cyclical development, recapturing those original elements.
Yeah, and this is sort of the experience, would you say, of remembering that we are remembering some of those qualities in that recapturing of the experience of the childlike when we are in childhood and feeling, maybe we're recapturing the vitality of our childhood in this through our spiritual development that is somehow aligned with that experience of remembering. That is what we were remembering.
Yeah, or maybe it might be more accurate to say recapturing or rekindling. It's something that was always there and is always there, but something that we have become alienated from due to our egoic development. There's probably some cultural conditioning as well, that we go to school and we're trained to be intellectual and to think abstractly. We're trained to kind of repress our creativity and our natural spirituality. But it's all of these things, once we transcend the ego, once our self boundaries become softer, we recapture all of these things, but we retain some of the benefits of egoic development too.
I definitely like I like the word recapture. I think when I think of the word remember, I think of persona, this experience, this ego experience in life as we were growing into adulthood. And we are, especially in modern times, our consciousness, our experience of self, our awareness is so fractured. It is so fractured and fragmented. And so the remembering is like putting my arm back on. It's like putting the pieces back together. And that is like the idea of recapturing. We've let go of kind of the thing that is already, it is always there. It is always and still there. It's just we've kind of like disconnected from our relationship to it, and then we are recapturing that relationship to it so that we can live, more realized experiences of the collective integrativeness and connection with others.
Yeah, it's a kind of reconnection. I mean, children are naturally connected. They don't have a sense of separation. They have this sense of participating in the world without being separated from it. And certainly, we become disconnected as we become adults. And if we become awakened, we become reconnected.
Mhm.
So in a sense, remembering, if you think of member in the sense of being a part of something, being a member of reality of the world,
Yeah.
then remembering is a pretty good definition. It's like becoming a participant again, becoming a part of the world rather than a separate observer.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Becoming a participant again. I did have Dr. Jorge Freire on the podcast some time ago. So, you know, when we talk about the embodied experience of that child, that they're embodying those qualities of you know, the spiritual qualities that we are recapturing as we are.
Yeah, I mean, that's why a lot of spiritual traditions they talk about. They, you know, they extol childhood as an ideal state. You know, in the Tao Te Ching, it says, what does it say? It says, "Return to the state of the infant." And
Mm,
Jesus said, "You must become as a little child if you want to enter the kingdom of heaven,"
yeah.
something like that. So yeah, I think, you know, these spiritual traditions, they recognize that. They're not saying that children are enlightened, but they know that there are some naturally spiritual qualities in children which we need to rekindle.
Mm, yeah. Really cool. So in this same article, I was inspired by this term. You started to speak about the, or you wrote about the two kinds of spiritual experiences, and now I'm probably starting to mix other articles as well that you've written. But you use this term homeostatic disruption that I sort of fell in love with. I really love this idea of homeostatic disruption. I think it just applies so well. Some of the conversation that we've already had, I'm seeing the dynamic relationship between the microcosm and the macrocosm, the individual and the collective, and I'm seeing how, you know, the reason that the individual works on their spiritual awakening is to influence and impact and in be a great demonstration and example and a light for others to experience the same and see the benefits and see the value in recognizing and being aware of our interconnectedness. This homeostatic disruption comes in the form of many things. And when it originally, my interest in transpersonal psychology was exceptional human experiences, just this idea that somebody could have a very immediate transformation and a very, very immediate, from one day to the next or one moment to the next, that somebody could be just
Mm.
like totally operating in their lives with a different set of beingness qualities, maybe that being catalyzed by a homeostatic disruption, maybe of psychedelic substances. Originally, I was interested in the psychedelic experience, but that has matured and expanded
Mhm.
to encompass things. And that homeostatic disruption that maybe we get with a psychedelic induced by a
Mhm.
medicine, by a substance, or by an experience, by a near-death experiences, a car crash, the
Yeah.
traumatic experiences that do the same, is really fascinating to me. And then this reintegration, this rekindling of a homeostasis, maybe this recapturing in an efficient homeostatic reintegration. Um,
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've always been fascinated by what I call awakening experiences, like temporary spiritual experiences. I used to have them myself. I still do, but you know, I had them originally when I was a teenager and I didn't really understand them. I'd have these moments of connection to my surroundings, there's moments of feeling uplifted and feeling euphoric. I mean, most of the time when I was a teenager, I was quite depressed and alienated, but I'd have these moments of euphoria when the world seemed to be incredibly alive and clouds and trees seemed to be sentient and everything seemed to be kind of vibrating in harmony, including me. So I always wanted to understand these experiences. I always collected examples of them, reports of them, and studied other people's collections of them. And I wanted to understand why they occur. And so I use the term homeostasis or homeostatic disruption to refer to one type of awakening experiences, which occurs when, you know, our physiology or our neurological functioning is disrupted quite significantly. And that's why people have always fasted to try to induce spiritual experiences. That's why people have inflicted pain on themselves, like the ascetics always used to do. And, people have practiced breathing, breath control, and people have taken psychedelic drugs, all to sort of disrupt our normal homeostasis so that we can slip out of our normal state of consciousness into this transcendent realm. And but awakening experiences can also be caused by what I call an intensification stilling of life energy. That's when we induce a mood of intense relaxation, intense inner stillness, where our life energy intensifies. And once our life energy, our inner life energy, reaches a certain intensity, then we switch out of our normal automatic perception, and our normal self boundaries seem to fade away. We feel connected to our surroundings. The world becomes a much more beautiful, a much more real place. And then there's actually a third category of awakening experiences, which I didn't actually consider at the time I wrote about this 20 years ago. But more recently, I've realized that awakening experiences can also be induced by, I guess this is probably connected to homeostasis, but you mentioned this too. They can be induced by intense trauma, by traumatic experiences such as bereavement, such as a serious illness, such as a period of depression or intense stress. All of those, psychological turmoil in general is quite a significant trigger of awakening experiences.
Yeah. I think of those experiences as like a psychological homeostatic disruption. And I think that while the substances can be like physiologically disrupting, there's also the phenomena of the experience, the phenomenology of the experience that becomes sort of disrupted and disintegrated, homeostatically disintegrated, so that it can be reorganized with the help of insights that maybe the insights and the knowingness that is found in those experiences is like in between stuff. It's like it was like hidden behind all the stuff that was there. And then as you said with you just articulated it so well. I'll have to go back and take a look at that, but it's like I have seen that the homeostatic disruption can happen to enlighten a person. It can be an awakening experience, and then also in deep meditation, it doesn't. You are not required to use a psychedelic substance to experience an awakening. That a meditative experience, a stilling of the body, mind, and soul, really deepening your experience to stillness and silence and the in-betweenness and the nothingness, really building your relationship there, can also be that same awakening experiences. So I like that you're putting it as three different ways as well.
Yeah, certainly. That's why meditation can bring about awakening experiences, but also contact with one of the biggest triggers of awakening experiences is contact with nature. And that's because contact with nature has a meditative effect. It stills our life energy, intensifies our life energy. It slows down our mental chatter. So I think there are a whole class of awakening experiences related to inner stillness and relaxation.
Yeah, so I sort of see that as, maybe just like trying to use the same term for all of these, and applying it to all these. Maybe there is there's a problem of there's kind of like it becomes a little bit too ambiguous. It begins to lose its defining qualities. But I even see like in that sort of stillness experience, there's a because what is the homeostasis? If the homeostasis is of a non-awakened, like the somnambulistic sort of sleepwalkingness, if that is the current homeostasis, then whether you go up or down, it still comes full circle, and it does still disrupt the original.
Oh, definitely, yeah. Yeah, maybe disruption isn't perhaps the right term. It's a kind of like a transcendence, perhaps, of, I
Yeah.
mean, the normal human consciousness is produced by psychological structures and psychological processes. What most human beings perceive as reality is actually the product of their psychological processing and their psychological structures. So the kind of like the familiarized automatic perception which most people have, which most people experience, is produced by what I call a desensitizing mechanism, which kind of switches off our attention to reality. And also the sense of separation, which most people experience, is produced by, a psychological boundary, a sense of psychological boundary. So in certain situations, those psychological structures are disrupted or transcended or undone, if you like. And that's when we transcend our normal perception. That's when we shift into, an awakening experience. Or maybe if it's if it's an ongoing long-term process, we slowly switch into an ongoing state of wakefulness in which it becomes our normal mode of being.
Mm-hmm. Do you I'm wondering about your perspective on this term, non-symbolic consciousness. Are you familiar with the work of the Non-Symbolic Consciousness Society for Non-Symbolic Consciousness?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
This is like
I,
Combs. This is Combs and Jeffrey Martin, Alan
yeah.
Combs, Jeffrey Martin.
Yeah, I mean, I read Jeffrey Martin's book, The Finders, a while ago.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the only thing I find a bit puzzling about it is that in my research, I've done a lot of research on people who experience wakefulness as an ongoing state. I guess that's equivalent to what they call non-symbolic consciousness.
Yeah.
And it's equivalent to what people call enlightenment. But I found there are lots of different degrees of wakefulness. It can occur in an intense level or a less intense level. And I don't think it's uncommon at a less intense level. And I think a lot of people who go through intense psychological turmoil undergo a shift into a stable state of wakefulness. I sometimes call that transformation through turmoil. It can happen after bereavement or a diagnosis of cancer, a long period of addiction, long period of depression. People sometimes, it's as if their normal identity dissolves and a new identity emerges, a new kind of spiritually awakened identity emerges to replace it. But in my research, it's incredibly rare that anybody experiences complete, mental quietness, a complete lack of thought. What is much more common is that people definitely experience a lower level of thought activity, maybe 10 or 20% of what they're used to, but it doesn't disappear altogether. The most important aspects of it is that people do not identify with their thought activity. To them, thinking is just like a kind of a physiological process which takes place a bit like, the circulation of the blood or digestion. It just happens and they don't identify with it. So they don't derive their identity from it. They don't allow their mood to be affected by the content of their thoughts. So yeah, so in my research, to experience, a completely non-symbolic consciousness is, I don't think I've ever, interviewed or investigated anybody who experiences that. Even the most highly awakened people I've interviewed, they still experience some degree of thought activity,
Yeah, it's interesting.
but just at a very low level.
It's interesting that I believe Dr. Martin's work. I really love Dr. Martin, but I am always so connected and also disconnected. I really connected with the research interests and disconnected with this term non-symbolic consciousness. It just to release the world of symbol, like it even the experience that is being described as non-symbolic is a symbol. Like it itself is symbolic of this greater landscape of interconnectedness in the universe, this universal connected awareness. But so I find it just troubling to use the term that way, but I do see it as this knowingness, and to experience a state and build closer relationship to it, there is a knowingness that does allow for a softening of the content of the mind. It does allow for a lowering of the intensity of the thinking mind that creates all the content that gets in the way of our authentic self-knowing.
Yeah, that's certainly true. Yeah, there's certainly, you know, one of the biggest shifts in awakening is an identity shift from, you know, the self which is derived from thinking to a self which stands apart from the process of thinking, the kind of witnessing or observing self. That's definitely a major shift. And just that process of disidentification from the ego, you know, there are so many things which come with that. You know, it brings so many positive changes in our lives but that's probably the, you know, the most important aspect of spiritual awakening, I think.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So there is recently been a sort of homeostatic disruption collectively, societally. And that, I would say, you know, over the last 3 years, we've been, you know, stuck in homes, allowed to go out of our homes, back in our homes. We've had these tremendous experiences of in and out, and just being so disrupted. And it always seems like a new page is turning, a new chapter. It just, we're always in transition. And right now, our global economy is really in flux and sort of confused and disrupted. And there's a lot of powers that would maybe be described as influenced disconnectedly influential powers that are in charge and trying to make things happen, putting the parts together in the ways that that these powers know how. What do you think is what is the integration process for humanity collectively? What is the remembering or the recapturing of the connectedness collectively?
I think we are going through a critical stage in, you know, the development of our species. You know, we're living in a time of crisis, possibly close to cataclysms. You know, certainly environmentally or ecologically, we're quite close to cataclysms if they are not already occurring. But there's a, you know, awakening is often connected to crisis. You know, when people are diagnosed with cancer that they awaken. It's when people suffer from intense depression that they reevaluate their lives and reorder their priorities. And something similar may be happening collectively. It may be connected to the trauma of the pandemic. You know, interesting, there have been some studies showing that the pandemic has led to collective post-traumatic growth for communities. And certainly the threat of ecological catastrophe has become more real and is probably affecting people's perspective. So I think that possibly in the same way that somebody who's diagnosed with cancer undergoes an awakening or a transformation, that may be occurring collectively. You know, I think there is a process of awakening taking place collectively, and our collective crises, you know, are one of the triggers of that. So, you know, I think there is actually research showing that spiritual experiences or mystical experiences have become more common over the past few decades. Certainly in terms of cultural trends, the interest in spirituality and self-development is one of the main trends of our time. It's probably exponentially increasing. You know, that's probably one of the biggest trends I've noticed in my lifetime, you know, since I've been an adult, is the increasing popular interest in spirituality. So there are lots of positive trends that are taking place. And also in my research, I mentioned the phenomenon of transformation through turmoil, when people go through crises in their lives and undergo a transformation. You know, I'm constantly amazed at how common this is. Almost every week, somebody writes to me to say that they've undergone this kind of transformation that I've researched and written about. And it's often people who don't know anything about spirituality in a traditional context. They don't really understand what's happened to them. They just know that they've undergone this shift and the world seems like a different place. Other people, their relationships feel different. everything feels different, but they don't really understand why. Sometimes they even suspect that they may have gone crazy, but eventually they realize that they've not, that they've undergone some kind of positive transformation. So all of these trends are taking place, possibly in response to the crises we are facing.
Yeah. Is is there is there a is there a value in a person like that, having experienced an awakening experience and not quite having maybe the language around it? Is there a value in them having more information, knowing more in the language and understanding of their experience?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, it's really important to have that context to make sense of it. I mean, I interviewed one guy and used to be quite friendly with a guy who, at the time I spoke to him, he was in his late 80s, and he underwent his spiritual awakening when he was 29 in about 1950, and he had no idea what happened to him. He had no language no concepts to describe what had happened to him. And it took him years to understand it. For a long time, he thought he was crazy. He tried to speak to religious people about it, and they thought he was crazy. So it actually took him 9 years before he met somebody who could understand what happened to him. He met a Buddhist by chance in London who said, "Oh, you sound like you're enlightened. This is pure Buddhism what you're speaking about." But now, it wouldn't take 9 years. It'd take probably 9 days to understand what happened to you, because there's so much information available through the internet or through books or through other spiritual teachings and spiritual teachers. So that's a really positive development that people can undergo awakenings, and fairly quickly they can find a context to make sense of them rather than being confused or doubting their sanity. So that's definitely, is as you probably know through your work in spiritual emergencies, it's easy for awakenings to be pathologized in the wrong. If you encounter a incomprehending psychiatrist, or so there's less danger of that happening now than probably ever before, even though it's obviously still a possibility, unfortunately.
Yeah, I would say, definitely a significant less likelihood that you would not be able to find an outlet or find some language to continue to develop and learn about your experience, without being impacted by some external circumstances. But there is still like a great amount of that as well.
Oh
You're
yeah.
not accepting that experience, or there is a pathological paradigm at foot in psychology, in
Oh,
psychiatry.
definitely. Mm,
So
yeah.
so
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
these things are happening. What does is it, do we focus on the individual recapturing their awakening, recapturing their connectedness in order to have that a massive influence impact on the ways that the whole dynamic is working?
To a degree, certainly, yeah. But we also create an environment, a more supportive environment, which allows people to make sense of their experiences. I mean, I've met so many people in my research who went through this period of incomprehension, and it sometimes took them maybe a few months to understand what happened to them. And if you don't understand, if you go through an awakening and don't really understand it, you can repress it. You can force it to the back of your mind or your being,
Yeah.
and try to forget that it happened. But that doesn't work. It always returns. It will always come to the forefront again. And but yeah, it's certainly a process of increasing understanding and acceptance. I mean, even in my own case, I was probably, as I said before, I had spiritual experiences at a young age, and I had no idea what to make of them. And I thought, they were more evidence that I was crazy. And it took me a few years to realize that I wasn't crazy, that I'd undergone positive experiences, transformational experiences, spiritual experiences. But it was only once I read books on mysticism that I learned that.
Yeah. So what were some of these transformative experiences in your life, or do you have experiences that I know you have books on reflections and poetry and meditative exercises. Do you have certain direction that you tend towards for people's spiritual awakening? Maybe something you experience as well.
Well, in my book, The Leap, I suggest that there are three ways in which awakening can occur. The first is when it's natural, when people are just naturally spiritually awakened. They don't need to meditate. They don't need to undergo a transformational experience due to stress or turmoil. They just are naturally awakened as their normal state. Or maybe they just don't lose the natural wakefulness of children like other people do. The second way is when people follow paths of awakening, so that awakening occurs gradually over many years through meditation or following a spiritual path. The third way is when it occurs suddenly and spontaneously, which is usually when it occurs in the context of psychological turmoil, like bereavement or diagnosis of cancer and so forth. But I probably had a degree of natural wakefulness that was just inside me, and it manifested itself when I was a teenager, and all it needed really was to be understood and accepted, which was quite a difficult process. So for me, it was a question of kind of nurturing my natural wakefulness and stabilizing it, which took, even once I accepted and understood it, it took quite a long time to stabilize it and integrate it. I think a lot of spiritual people have a problem kind of integrating. When they're younger, they have a problem kind of integrating into ordinary life, functioning in normal society, partly because normal society is, antithetical to spirituality in many ways. So it took me a long time to learn to function in normal society and to integrate my spirituality into everyday life. So yeah, my development has been a question of doing that and sort of stabilizing and exploring in more depth and detail.
So the exploration that one goes through, you encourage exploration of self through meditation. Is that
Yeah.
what
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's true in every case, in every human being's case, that, once we quieten the ego mind, once we go below the surface of the mind, the surface thought activity of the mind, everyone is capable of touching into, an essential spirituality within them. Is that it exists in everybody, no matter how full of turmoil your mind is, no matter how full of discord the surface of your mind is, there is always a harmony beneath the surface of your mind. So in my poems or my meditations, I encourage people to go beneath the surface of their mind, to attune to their natural harmony. And once you're attuned to that natural harmony within yourself, you also attune to the harmony of the world, because at that level, there is no separation between you and the world. You touch into the essential oneness of all things. You touch into a pure consciousness, which doesn't just belong to you. It's the source of everything and it pervades everything. So yeah, I try to encourage people to touch into that essential oneness and that pure consciousness.
That's awesome. The so well said. Yeah, thank you so much for that. So, how did you develop this relationship with Eckhart Tolle? Eckhart Tolle has had some like really great things to say about your books. You've become a part of the is it the like the Eckhart Tolle collection? Some of your books have been a part of the Eckhart Tolle collection. How did you develop this relationship?
Well, it goes back to 2005, almost 20 years ago. I published a book called The Fall, which was my first, I think it was my first sort of proper publication with a kind of mainstream publisher. And coincidentally, the publication of The Fall was on exactly the same day as Eckhart Tolle's book, A New Earth, if you remember that one. So I thought, wow, this is a coincidence. They were both published on exactly the same day. When I read A New Earth, I thought, wow, this is actually quite similar to my book, The Fall. It's sort of dealing with the same, the same themes. And I mean, the main theme of both books is the kind of the pathological effects of the ego in human history, and how the ego, causes such chaos in human behavior and in human society. So I sent a copy of The Fall to Eckhart's office, and not expecting to hear anything back. But a few months later, I got an email from his assistant saying, "I am Eckhart Tolle's assistant. He really loves your book, The Fall. He'd like to talk to you about it and help you promote it." So, fantastic. So I spoke to him on the phone a few days later, and then he was so helpful. He recommended The Fall to his fans and his newsletters, and as a result, it became, it sold really well, gained a lot of attention, and we remained in contact. And I think Eckhart is some people don't realize, but he's actually a very intellectual guy. He was doing a Ph.D. in England, a Ph.D. in philosophy when he had his awakening. So he has a very acute intellect, and he's very well read in philosophy and psychology. And I think that's one of the reasons why his teachings are so effective, because they have this kind of intellectual clarity about them, which is combined with this spiritual clarity or spiritual purity. So we became quite friendly. He invited me to Canada to film an interview for his internet TV channel, which he had at that time. And we just remained in friendly contact ever since. And in 2014, he told me that he was starting a publishing company. He wanted to publish one of my books of poetry as his first publications. I thought, wow, that's fantastic. So yeah, he's been really helpful to me, and I don't hear much from him these days. But whenever we meet, we have it always feels like a great occasion, and he's so lovely and so kind and such a kind of warm, benevolent person.
That's awesome. It definitely comes through in his writing that it's not just a spiritual man, but an academic, a philosopher. Definitely comes through in the writing. So that's really awesome that you had this blessed opportunity to meet and match with such a notable figure in the field of in spirituality.
Yeah. I think that combination of intellectual rigor and deep spirituality is not very common, but when it happens, it's incredibly powerful. I think the Buddha, he was somebody who had an incredibly acute intellect and this spiritual power. So it's great when that happens. I think Ken Wilber had that too. Certainly in some of his books, there was this kind of tremendous intellectual strength and clarity combined with this spiritual insight. It's incredibly powerful.
Yeah, Ken Wilber does an amazing job of that. I think definitely this is the way of the field of transpersonal psychology, is to have both of those things applied and integrated in a way that is beautiful. I really have always resonated with this idea of spiritual pragmatism, like making the spirituality practical, and you do that by grounding it in scientific rigor. In this field, it's of great value to humanity and the world at large. So oftentimes people that are going to be tuning into this are scholars. They are these kind of people that have this scientific, rigorous, intellectual prowess and curiosity, and they're interested in the spiritual aspects of life and their own awakening and beyond. So how do you stay in alignment with your writing practice, with like your practices of spiritual exploration? How do you continue over these years and all of this research? How do you continue to deepen that? How do you continue to be such a prolific scholar in the field?
I try to remain open. I don't really feel in control of what I write. Poetry is a good example. I never try to write poetry. It just sort of comes when it comes, and sometimes it doesn't come. But when it comes, I just allow it to flow through. And so I think it's important to remain open and not to be too conscious about it. So I just try to, I meditate. I love to exercise. I love running and swimming and cycling and all of that stuff. And most of all, I love contact with nature. I love to go walking and climbing. So I think all of these things, they help to keep me open and help to, allow creativity to flow through me. And it's about making space as well. I mean, sometimes it's about allowing yourself the opportunity to be creative. Not getting distracted, keeping spaces of time open in your life. So I do that. Turning the internet off for a few hours. So you don't get distracted. And just being. You have to honor your creativity. You have to respect it. If you don't take it seriously, if you don't treat it with care and respect, it may not flow. So you have to be really respectful towards it and treat it with the seriousness and care that it deserves.
Yeah, you seriously have a good time as you're being creative. Seriously have a good time.
Yeah, I mean, it's wonderful. There's nothing for me. There are lots of kind of entertainments that I enjoy. There are lots of activities that I enjoy, but for me, the most fulfilling activity of all is writing. Just to sit down at my computer and allow my creativity to express itself. There's nothing that I enjoy more than that.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much for all that you have written and all of that you have expressed through you, all of your creativity. You have made a massive impact on the field of transpersonal psychology. And as that quote from Eckhart Tolle, you are making very important contributions to the spiritual awakening collectively. And so, thank you for all of your work. I really appreciate this conversation. There's so much value in it. I think that other people will be very surprised, enlightened, feel very inspired to continue to follow your work. This latest book, Disconnected. I love the title, and then capitalized connected. It really just like points to the both and there's a grayness there that I like. I like all of those things. So I thank you for allowing this space and giving your time to this conversation. Is there anywhere else that you want people to go?
Well, thank you first of all, Travis. That was I really enjoyed our conversation. It was very, very fruitful, and good luck with your endeavors. Well, people can look at my website, which is stephenmtaylor.com. That's Stephen with a V, M for Mark, stephenmtaylor.com. And I have lots of poems and articles and other information on my website. And also I'm on social media on Facebook or Twitter.
Awesome. Cool. So thank you so much. I know it's getting dark there in the UK. I can see it now.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the conversation, Stephen.
Yeah, thank you, Travis.
You're thinking, who is this man talking to? I'm talking to you. You